Were the Gospels written too late to be eyewitness accounts? Now, without a doubt, this is one of the main objections that you hear from atheists. But is it justified? Do we really have good reason to believe that the Gospels were written too late? Or does the evidence actually show that the Gospels were written a lot earlier than most atheists care to admit? Let's find out. So to establish a timeline, we're going to start with the book of Acts. Now, the book of Acts was, of course, written by Luke, who also wrote another book, the Gospel of Luke. Now, we know that the Gospel of Luke was written before the book of Acts, but when it comes to the Gospels, the position of scholars is that Mark was written first, and then Matthew, Luke, and then John. It's typically argued that the Gospels were written sometime between 70 AD and 90 AD. However, I would argue there's evidence that the Gospels were written even earlier than 70 AD, because here's the thing. We've already established that Acts was written after the Gospel of Luke, but Paul was still alive at the end of the book of Acts. He was still in Rome preaching the gospel, which can only mean that he was still alive when the book was being written. Because let's be honest, Paul wrote about half of the books in the New Testament, not to mention he was the main focus in the book of Acts. So I think it's reasonable to conclude that if he would have died before the book of Acts was finished, it would have been mentioned. Now this is extremely important because the historical data tells us that Paul was executed around 64 AD, which means that the book of Acts probably wasn't written any later than about 62 or 63 AD. So here's the timeline. We have the book of Acts, which based on the evidence was probably written in the early 60s, prior to 64 AD at the latest. But the Gospel of Luke was written before the book of Acts, which means it was probably written sometime in the 50s. And since we know Mark and Matthew were written before Luke, we could probably place them being written sometime in the 40s. So instead of the Gospels being written 40 to 60 years after the resurrection, we have them being written about 15 to 20 years after the resurrection. And then another interesting piece of evidence that the Gospel was written earlier than 70 AD is the fact that Paul quotes Luke's Gospel in his first letter to Timothy. In 1 Timothy chapter 5:18, Paul writes, and I quote, "For the scripture saith, Thou shalt not muzzle the ox that treadeth out the corn, and the laborer is worthy of his reward." End quote. And then when you go to Luke chapter 10, verse 7, here's what you find, and I quote, "And in the same house remain, eating and drinking such things as they give, for the laborer is worthy of his hire. Go not from house to house." End quote. So you already have Paul quoting the Gospel of Luke in his first letter to Timothy, which is argued to have been written somewhere between 58 AD and 64 AD. And one more piece of evidence is the fact that the destruction of the temple isn't mentioned in the Gospels or anywhere in the New Testament for that matter. This is very interesting because Jesus prophesied the destruction of the temple in Mark 13, verse 2, which actually took place in 70 AD. So you would think if the Gospels were written after 70 AD that the authors would have mentioned the destruction of the temple, or that would have been mentioned somewhere in the New Testament, considering it was one of the biggest events in all of Jewish history, and something that Jesus himself prophesied about. But what you find is that it's not mentioned anywhere in the New Testament. Perhaps that's because the whole New Testament was written prior to 70 AD. Something to think about at least. In any case, based on all of these pieces of evidence put together, I think it's very safe to conclude that the Gospels had to have been written before 70 AD, which means they were definitely written early enough to be eyewitness accounts. Well, guys, that's the video. Let me know what you think, and remember to like and subscribe.